Attila has arrived. The Hunnic invasion of Central Europe and the Empire was cataclysmic. The Empire, already faced with economic and social issues rotting the core of its structure, was unready for its last great military operation. This is the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. Tens of thousands of horsemen and Germanic warriors will descend on Roman Gaul in 451, bringing the frontiers of the Empire collapsing. Had the Huns arrived 50 years before, they would have encountered a powerful state wielding vast resources, millions of citizens, and an army numbering in the hundreds of thousands. But now all we'll find is a rotting corpse of a distant golden age. Misrole and division within the Empire, but it all collapsing down within 5 decades. The East had largely avoided the total collapse the West had seen, but instead of leveraging its vast resources to support the West, it abandoned the homeland of the Roman Empire. The Hunnic Empire rose from a collection of nomadic people migrating west during the late 4th century. Possibly driven west by climatic conditions or political instability, the homeland of the Huns was no longer able to support their population or way of life. The Huns were a militarily capable people, and their arrival into Eastern Europe would push tens of thousands of Germanic people into the Roman Empire. These migrations in themselves destabilized the frontiers of the Empire, and even sacked Rome in 410. While the sack of Rome wasn't particularly damaging, it did mark a serious decline in Roman military capabilities. By the time of Attila's reign in 435, the Hunnic people had established dominion over a great majority of Europe outside the Roman Empire. Goths, Franks, Burgundians, and Gepids had all submitted before the horde. Splinter groups from these people, most notably the Visigoths and the Salian Franks, would migrate into the Roman Empire and become federati. Federati was an agreement between the Romans and Germanic invaders that allowed German people to settle within the Roman Empire with political autonomy. They would in turn support the Roman military. This system, more often than not, though, failed to settle the Germanic people and result in greater military challenges for the Romans. Its federati refused to serve unless it serviced their own political interests. Flavius Aetius was the Magister Militum of the West, or the head military leader of the Western Roman army, and was born sometime in the 390s. Throughout the crisis period following division of the Empire, he served with the Roman army, winning considerable victories in Gaul. Political intrigue in the late 420s involving Aetius and Galla Placidia, the mother to the Emperor Valentinian III, had allowed the Empire to lose control of Africa, clearly showing that Aetius was the last real power behind the Western Empire. The only general to win consistent victories, his influence came into full power around 433, and he was able to stem the tide. The general crisis continued, but Roman territorial losses had been minimalized. Leading up to the Hunnic invasion of 450, the Huns had devastated the Balkan regions of the Eastern Roman Empire, with a splinter group heading east tormenting Armenia, later moving on to Persia. The Eastern Roman Empire, however, was a completely different beast from that of the West. The East still had vast sums of wealth to call upon and a capable military. The East had suffered immensely from the Battle of Adrianople in 378 against a force of displaced Goths. This was a true turning point in Western warfare, but they were still able to recover and go on fighting against the Huns for multiple decades more than the Western Romans were going to. The damage to the Eastern Roman Empire's military at the Battle of Adrianople was immense, with a whole generation of military officers lost in the fighting. Even with these great setbacks in the East, the Romans were able to hold their own and regroup, thanks in part to Constantinople, but mostly to economic reforms and reduced conflict with Persia. By the time Attila the Hun had come onto the scene in the 430s, the Hunnic people had been ravaging Europe and the Romans for over 5 decades, slowly collecting German tribes under their empire and forcing disloyal peoples west into Rome. For the first few years of Attila's reign, he would share power with his brother, but after a suspected secession dispute, he would emerge as the sole ruler of the vast empire. After consolidating his power in the aftermath of this dynastic struggle, he would attempt an assault on the east, and the great jewel of the late empire, Constantinople. Originally defeating the Emperor Theodosius II in 441 and extracting a huge tribute, he left only to return in 447. His assault was aided by a massive earthquake damaging the walls of Constantinople. The prefect of the city was able to rebuild the walls and stave off Attila, while the future Emperor Zeno arrived with a force of Isaurians. The new Rome had been saved for the time being. The Western Romans and the Huns had originally been on good terms leading up and through the beginning of Attila's reign. The Huns had been more focused on the wealthier east, but as the east had held its own against the Huns, Attila began to look west. The Vandalic invasion of Africa in 429 had significantly weakened the Roman state's tax income, robbing the Western Empire of one of its wealthiest provinces. Combined with the settling of the Visigothic people in southern Gaul, the Empire of the West was clearly facing greater difficulties than the east. This prompted Attila to head west in 450. Tens of thousands of horsemen were heading west to sack Gaul. Attila's invasion in 450 was initially successful, bringing dozens of cities in northern Gaul to their knees, until he reached the city of Orleans. That city, which would make Joan of Arc famous in 1,000 years, stood firm against the Huns. The siege of Orleans was the real turning point for the Hunnic invasion of Gaul. Had Orleans fallen, Aetius likely would have never been able to convince the Huns to fight the pitched battle of the Catalaunian fields. The king of the Hunnic Empire and the last Romans stand across the fields of Catalaunian. Thousands of legionnaires, supported by the Germanic foederati, faced the Hunnic hordes supported by their own Germanic vassals. Visigoths, threatened by the arrival of the Huns and wanting revenge for the invasion of their homeland 7 decades prior, when the Huns had first arrived in Europe, joined the Romans. While the Franks, split by a succession crisis, supported both sides, with the supporters of the younger prince standing with the Romans, and the supporters of the older prince standing with the Huns. At the start of the battle, the Romans held the left flank, while the Visigoths held the right. A ridge between the Romans and Hunnic forces forced both sides into close-quarter combat. Repelling Hunnic forces throughout the afternoon, the Romans and Huns became locked in conflict over this ridgeline. Unable to dislodge the Romans, the Huns were eventually pushed back by the Visigoths into Theodoric. With bodies piling and both sides taking huge casualties, the Huns were being slowly forced back. With the Goths finally forcing their way deep into the Hunnic line, sending Attila himself running back to his camp. Their king Theodoric I was slain. Sources vary to how he was slain, but Jordanes mentions a fellow Goth of the separate Ostrogothic tribe landing the killing blow. With the king dead, the Visigoths began to waver. However, they were rallied by the king's son, Thorzemond, who was able to push back the Huns, and eventually push them off the field. The Huns had been defeated. Attila held in his camp, refusing to surrender, and prepared for his last stand against the Romans. However, Aetius hesitated and did not order his forces forward. Aetius instead sent the Visigoths home to secure their kingdom, while he besieged Attila, eventually allowing the king of the Huns to escape. Aetius likely did not end the Hunnic threat that day for a few reasons. The damage the Hunnic caused was already immense. Attila had been turned back before, but never outright defeated. This ruined his image and formed cracks within the Hunnic realm. The most likely, however, is that the Visigothic threat to the empire was more apparent than the Huns. While the Visigoths had sided with the empire against the Huns, they likely would not have continued to without the Hunnic threat. The retreat of Attila did not end the Hunnic invasion, but it did close the last great story of the late Roman Empire. Following the battle, Attila would continue to raid the west, eventually entering Italy. However, during his invasion, near the city of Mantua, the Hunnic king was met by Pope Leo I, who convinced him to withdraw from Italy. Seemingly met with divine intervention, the Romans survived the Hunnic onslaught. This is likely untrue and a piece of papal propaganda following the fall of Rome to give legitimacy to papal rule. The Hunnic invasion of Italy failed because a poor harvest the previous year had left the countryside barren and unable to feed his massive host. Without the food, Attila had to withdraw. Attila would die early in 453 and would soon be followed by his empire. The Hunnic invasion of the Western Roman Empire was short, brutal, and largely ended any hope for Roman survival. The Romans had been able to defeat this nomadic group from the steppe, but they had thrown every last resource available onto the fields of Catalonia.